Hello, BISC1323. This is the beginning of recorded lecture 4.1, getting into this chapter on vertebrates. Now, I want to start off by going back to this phylogenetic tree that we looked at for so many lectures related to the previous exam. At this point, we're in Phylum Chordata looking at vertebrates, and we need a better phylogenetic tree. We need something that's going to zoom in a little bit further than this one. So I'm now going to introduce the phylogenetic tree that we'll be using for this chapter, looking specifically at chordates. So we've got lampreys, sharks, bony fish, amphibians, mammals, reptiles, and birds. There we go. So talking about vertebrates, we're going to start with fish, or grammatically, you are allowed to say fishes and pluralize it like this when we're talking about different evolutionary groups of fish. So yeah, fish includes several distinct groups, and if you remember our phylogeny terms, this is not an ancestor and all of its descendants. I mean, this is a clade, this is a clade, this is a clade, but all together, all these things that we refer to as fish, this is a paraphyletic group. Fish is not a clade, it's a paraphyletic group. That being said, there's a lot that fish have in common with one another, despite not being a monophyletic group. Most fish are ectotherms. So this is defined in the key terms as an animal incapable of maintaining a relatively constant internal body temperature. This is sometimes colloquially referred to as cold-blooded, and it makes sense to not burn a bunch of energy keeping yourself warm internally all the time if you're surrounded by water, and so which maintains a pretty consistent temperature. So yeah, most fish are quote-unquote cold-blooded. Most fish are ectotherms. So let's go through these different groups of fish. Technically, this is a class, but I don't think you need to worry about the name of this class. I want to talk about hagfish first, because these are the most primitive living group of fish. Hagfish are, they're not much to look at. They kind of look like worms, I guess, because they're limbless. If we focus on one here, yep. I mean, there's a head, there are some eyes, there's a mouth at one end, there's an anus at the other end, but what's not really obvious from this or this photo is the skeleton, the bones. Again, that's what vertebrae is supposed to be about, right? Well, these earliest fish have a skull, but they do not have vertebrae. They do not have spine bones. Instead, they're still relying on this notochord to support their spinal cord. So these earliest fish had a skull but no vertebral column. Spinal cord was protected by the notochord. And yeah, these are simple limbless scavengers at the bottom of the ocean. Up next, we have a group called lampreys. They look kind of the same, these limbless fish, but there's a major upgrade evolutionarily compared to hagfish, because lampreys have both a skull and a vertebral column. So this is the second thing to evolve here: skull and vertebral column. The vertebrae, those bones, replaced the notochord and fulfill this function of protecting the spinal cord. Importantly, there's no jaw yet. So we've got a skull, we've got vertebrae, we've got some teeth, which can be used to attach to a host. Many of these lampreys are parasites, but not all of them. Some of them are simple filter feeders, but there's not yet a jaw for chewing up food. That's going to come next. But for now, lampreys have a skull and a vertebral column, but not a jaw. And yeah, limbless parasites or filter feeders. So, wouldn't you know it, the next evolutionary innovation is going to be a jaw. And this is actually not a group of fish. This is a clade that is going to include all further groups, because the fish that evolved a jaw passed that body feature onto all of their descendants, which includes all further vertebrates. So all birds and reptiles and mammals and amphibians and all fish that have a jaw are members of this clade Gnathostomata, known as jawed vertebrates. They have a skull, a vertebral column, and a jaw. And again, the jaw is kind of a big deal. It unlocks additional modes of feeding rather than just being parasites or filter feeders or scavengers of small things. And so, yes, this clade Gnathostomata is not just a fish thing, it's a clade that includes all further groups. So, to go back to fish, there are a few more classes that I want to bring up. One of them is class Chondrichthyes. Chondrichthyes is, or includes, sharks and rays and skates and chimeras, but sharks and rays are the big ones. Chondrichthyes are known as cartilaginous fishes because their skeleton, again, skull, jaw, vertebral column, the skeleton is composed of cartilage as opposed to bone. So yeah, cartilaginous fishes, sharks, and rays. Now, there are some advantages and disadvantages to having a skeleton of cartilage. The advantage is that it's really lightweight, so you're not going to sink to the bottom of the ocean. You don't weigh as much. The disadvantage is that this is nowhere near as strong as bone. So the cartilaginous skeleton (parentheses not bone) is lightweight but not as strong as bone. Now, this is an important and worthy trade-off for these sharks and rays and other chondrichthyes because many of these need to move nearly constantly. It's called obligate ram ventilation, but many of them need to move all the time to flow new water over their gills and to just simply not sink to the bottom of the ocean. And if you're moving nearly constantly, that takes a lot of energy. And to have a skeleton that is lightweight saves a bunch of energy if you're always on the move. So the lightweight skeleton reduces energy spent in this near constant movement. So it's worth it even if it's not as strong. We also see another evolutionary innovation in here, paired fins. So yeah, look at these fins on either side of the body. Again, compared to hagfish or lampreys, which were limbless. Now we've got limbs, and that's another feature that's going to be passed on to all of their descendants. Chondrichthyes are mostly marine, and they're mostly carnivores. There are definitely some cool exceptions, but most of these things are carnivores. Now, on to the next two classes of fish, which are lumped together into a clade called osteichthyes. Osteichthyes is referred to as the bony fishes. I'll give you three guesses why. These bony fishes have a bone skeleton as opposed to a cartilaginous skeleton. This is by far the biggest group of fish on the planet. Think of a fish, as long as it's not a lamprey or a hagfish or a shark or a ray, it's going to be a bony fish. It's going to be osteichthyes. So bony fishes, bone skeleton. The bone skeleton is heavier but stronger than cartilage. And we just said that having a heavy skeleton was a liability. You're going to sink down. You're going to need to swim up constantly. You need to be on the move all the time. Well, there is something that bony fishes have that offset the weight of having a much heavier bone skeleton, and that is an organ called the swim bladder. So this is an organ that sharks and rays don't have. So cartilaginous fishes don't have this. Lampreys and hagfish don't have this, but bony fish do. The swim bladder is attached to the circulatory system. It can grab gases from the circulatory system to inflate with air to make the fish more buoyant, or it can release gases into the blood to become less buoyant. That allows these fish to achieve what their desired buoyancy is, even if their bodies are heavier. So yeah, great workaround. The other problem with being so heavy, if I can go back to my shark slide, is that many of these sharks needed to move nearly constantly to flow new water over their gills. If they just stayed in one place, they would suffocate basically, as they would use up all the oxygen in that water in the local environment. To get around this problem, Bony fishes have this structure called an operculum, or gill cover. Not only does it cover and protect the gills, but there are muscles attached to this flap that can move this back and forth and sort of circulate new water over the gills so they don't need to move constantly. So this operculum parentheses gill cover protects gills and helps pass water through the gills. Now, there are several extinct classes of osteichthyes, but there are two extant classes. And I think this is the first time that I've brought up these key terms. I think we all know what extinct means, but it's in the key terms. Extinct is a no longer existing species. Extant is maybe a new term for some of you. It's the opposite. The definition of extant is a still living species. So yeah, there used to be a lot more bony fishes. A lot of them have gone extinct, but let's focus on the ones that are alive today. Let's start off with class Actinopterygii. This is by far the biggest group of living bony fishes. Almost every bony fish alive today is part of class Actinopterygii. I'll note the two exceptions, but pretty much every fish you think of, whether it's a lionfish or a piranha or a trout or salmon or tuna or whatever, catfish, is going to be an Actinopterygii. So what's their deal? Well, Actinopterygii are also known as ray-finned fishes. And like I said, this encompasses almost all bony fish. They're called ray-finned fishes because their fins are webs of skin with thin spines. And here's what this looks like. Look at these paired fin appendages. There are some bones near the shoulder, but the actual fin itself is pretty thin and there aren't any muscles within the fin itself. It's a pretty simple structure. Which isn't a bad thing. This is obviously an incredibly successful group, but yeah, these are ray-fin fishes. Their fins are rays. The other group is called of extant bony fishes is Sarcopterygii, and there are only a few members alive today. There's the coelacanth, which is endangered, but it is alive today, and there are a few different species of lungfish. So their deal has to do with their limbs. So instead of being a simple ray, this is a sort of meteor structure. There are bones, there are muscles. This is a more robust limb, sometimes referred to as a lobe. So these Sarcopterygii can be called lobe-finned fishes. I'm just saying very few living members instead of calling out the species by name, but they have muscular bony fins instead of these simple rays. And yeah, here's a diagram that kind of shows that the arm itself, the fin, has muscles and bones in it. This was a worthwhile comparison because these Sarcopterygii and this limb that has muscles and has bones is evolutionarily the precursor to limbs that could bear weight on land. These lobe-finned fishes are the living ancestors to what would become land vertebrates. So that's why they're an important note here, even if there are very few living members. The fins of these fish, the lobe-finned fish, evolved into the limbs of all further vertebrates, which actually brings us to our next sort of umbrella category. This brings us to a superclass called Tetrapoda. So this evolution of 4 limbs for walking around or for flying or digging or swimming or whatever is something that's going to include all further groups. So this superclass Tetrapoda members have 4 limbs, as Tetrapoda implies, and this one includes all further groups. So yep, amphibians, mammals, reptiles, birds, everything from here on out is Tetrapoda. So now that we're done with fishes, let's move on next to class Amphibia, to amphibians. So Amphibians include, frogs and toads and salamanders and these friends, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But what are some basic things we can say about amphibia before we get into more specific groups? Well, amphibians were the first land vertebrates that evolved, and so they are the first vertebrates that had limbs that could support their weight outside of water. There were a lot of advantages to life on land. There's a lot of selective pressure for these vertebrates to evolve the ability to get on land. One of these is lots of tasty bugs to eat. So if you remember our history of the world rundown, invertebrates made it to land before vertebrates did. So yeah, a lot of these things walking around that you could munch on if you managed to survive on land. But also, getting on land meant you got to escape these aquatic environments, which were teeming with massive, terrifying predators at the time. And so definitely a lot of selective pressure to escape these things. So the advantages were new food sources and escape from predators. Now, if you're going to exist on land, there are some challenges. One of them is gills aren't going to cut it anymore. You got to have lungs, and indeed, amphibians do have lungs, but they're not very good. When we get to our chapters on animal anatomy and physiology, we'll talk about the circulatory system of amphibians, and it's not great. It's really inefficient. And so even amphibians that have lungs also have a way to do gas exchange called cutaneous respiration. So this cutaneous respiration is essentially breathing through the skin. So here we can see kind of a cross section of the very thin skin. This is salamander skin, but this is going to be all amphibians, and some blood capillaries that are pressed up against this skin. This allows oxygen to come in and carbon dioxide to leave, passing directly through the skin in or out of this bloodstream. This, if I can go back many chapters ago, was why this Chytridiomycota fungus was so deadly to amphibians in particular, this aquatic swimming fungus, because their skin is so thin. But it has to be thin so they can breathe through it, and they have to breathe through it because their lungs are not good. So cutaneous respiration, these animals get oxygen, O2, through their skin, and it supplements their not so great lungs. Additionally, many amphibians undergo metamorphosis. Now, we talked about metamorphosis in the last chapter. This is an example. So here's metamorphosis in a newt, changing the body plan across the lifespan. The fact that amphibians do this and these hexapods do this, that's an example of convergent evolution. Two completely different groups coming up with a very similar idea of, hey, let's change the body over the course of the lifetime. So the metamorphosis of amphibians involves hatching in an aquatic environment and having gills, but then eventually developing lungs and becoming terrestrial. And the advantages to this are the same that I highlighted in this chapter talking about hexapods. It means that the young and the adults are not competing with resources, competing with each other for resources. They exist in completely different ecosystems. So yeah, they don't step on each other's toes, so to speak. Another feature, or I guess disadvantage to class Amphibia, is their skin and their eggs are not protected. And so I already mentioned that their skin was very thin, so they can do cutaneous respiration. Another downside to that is that they dry out really quickly. They need to stay in moist or humid, wet environments so their skin doesn't dry out. Additionally, their eggs also don't have any sort of protection around them. So they also need to be laid in the water or in a very damp, moist, humid environment because they're going to dry out otherwise. So these are the first land vertebrates, but they're not very good at it yet. So they exist on the land, but they really can't go that far from the water. Skin and eggs lack protection, must be in water or in a moist environment. Okay. Now, let's look at orders within class M, starting with order Urodela. Order Urodela is salamanders. There are lots of salamanders out here. Here are a couple of weird ones, actually. So I mentioned that most amphibians go through this metamorphosis here. There are some exceptions, like the axolotl, which never develops lungs, retains these gills even through adulthood, but that is atypical. Another one that's atypical is this California slender salamander, although there are many salamanders like this that have neither gills nor lungs as adults. They rely 100% on this cutaneous respiration for their gas exchange. So order Urodela means salamanders, and a good number of these don't have lungs, either gills only or cutaneous respiration only. This not having lungs at all is a lot more common among salamanders than in any of these other amphibians. The other order, or the next order, I should say, is order Anura. Anura is frogs and toads. So there are differences between frogs and toads, but that's not worth getting into. At the order level, it includes both of them. And I'm not going to say anything more than that. So just know that Anura means frog and toad. The last order to talk about is order Apoda. Oh, here's Poda. We haven't seen Poda in a while, but yeah, as always, this means foot. A as a prefix means without or lacking. So Apoda means without poda, without feet. That is where we look at this weird purple looking thing that we saw, a few slides ago. This is an animal called a Sicilian. And at first glance, it kind of looks like an earthworm, but if you look at it more closely, you can see, oh, there are jaws, there are teeth, there are eyes, there's a skull, there's vertebrae. This is a vertebrate, and you may guess that maybe it's a tiny snake, but if you look more closely at how it lives, you see that it's an amphibian that has gone snake mode or has gone worm mode. Importantly, this is still a member of Tetrapoda. Again, I said this Tetrapoda is going to include all further groups. Yep, there's the Sicilian there. This is a tetrapod that has lost its limbs due to evolution. Again, to live the lifestyle that it lives of burrowing in the of detritus and leaf litter and stuff like that in soil, it is better off without its limbs. So it's a tetrapod, but it's lost its limbs. And we don't know that much more about them. This is kind of a mysterious group of amphibians. They live in the tropics of South and Central America, Africa, and I think Southeast Asia, the tropics. But yeah, this is how you spell Sicilians. Poorly understood, limbless burrowing amphibians. Okay, moving on. Next up is the section called reptiles. But actually, before we get to reptiles, there's another clade. So this is a clade that includes an ancestor here and all of its descendants. It's going to include mammals, it's going to include reptiles, and it's going to include birds. This group is called Amniota, and members are called amniotes. So remember these amphibian eggs? How they didn't have any real protection around them, and if they weren't surrounded by water or very humid air, they would dry out and die. Well, you could solve that problem by taking the embryo, surrounding it with water, and putting it in a sac that holds that water in. This water, as it were, is called amnion, and the structure that holds the embryo and the amnion is called an amniotic sac or amniotic cavity. So this is an evolutionary innovation that allows these eggs, to be laid outside of water. And we're looking at a shelled egg here. This could be a bird's shelled egg or a reptile's shelled egg. But remember, this clade includes mammals, reptiles, and birds. So mammals have an amnion, an amniotic sac as well. Instead of being inside of a shelled egg, it's inside of the parent. So yeah, here it looks like a baby human, but there's also amnion here, and amniotic fluid in here as well. When this baby's ready to be born and the water breaks, that water that comes out is the amniotic fluid. It's that amnion. So we see this in reptiles, birds, and mammals. So in summary, clade amniota. Again, this is a clade. Members are amniotes. The embryo is surrounded by amniotic fluid encased within an amniotic sac. This cushions and hydrates the growing embryo. This is important because eggs no longer need to be laid in water or moist environments. The amnion can be encased in a shell or within the parent's body. Either one works. Okay, and clade amniota includes all further groups, and it's going to include mammals, reptiles, and birds. Now, before we get to reptiles, there are 3 clades within amniota based on skull structure. This is a specific skull structure called a temporal fenestra, or temporal fenestrae is plural. We can just call it TF as an abbreviation. Temporal fenestrae are, well, let me read the key terms definition. Temporal fenestrae are a non-orbital opening in the skull that may allow muscles to expand and lengthen. Non-orbit, the orbit is where the eyeball goes. So this is an orbit, this is an orbit, this is an orbit. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about the nostril either. We're talking about these extra structures here, these extra openings. So this is showing us our 3 clades, our 3 different ways of having temporal fenestrae. There are anapsids, which don't have any temporal fenestrae. There are synapsids, which have 1 temporal fenestra on each side of the skull. And there are diapsids, which have 2 temporal fenestrae on each side of the skull. So what are these things? Because these skulls all look the same. What do these clades actually mean? Well, the anapsids have no temporal fenestrae. These include a bunch of extinct para-reptiles, they're sometimes called. All these things died in that Permian-Triassic extinction event, if you remember that. There are no living anapsids, but it is an important clade to note within amniota, not having any temporal fenestrae. So anapsids, no temporal fenestra, all extinct. Okay. What about the synapsids, which have 1 temporal fenestra on each side of the skull? These include mammals, and these friends also died in the Permian-Triassic extinction event, but these proto-mammals are more closely related to us than they are to dinosaurs or reptiles because they are part of this clade along with us. So these synapsids include mammals and so-called proto-mammals. And finally, we have diapsids, 2 temporal fenestrae on each side of the skull. This is going to include reptiles and birds. So, the 2 that are left, reptiles and birds, are in this diapsid clade. Okay, now we can finally start on reptiles, but this lecture has gone on long enough. I think we're going to pick up talking about reptiles in the next one. This is the end of recorded lecture 4.1.